What if the nursing home caring for your loved ones was actually hiding a dark, deadly secret? I worked the night shift at Willowbrook, and what I saw there still haunts me. My name is Jessica Martinez, and I worked as a night nurse at Willowbrook Care Home for 11 months. What I experienced there during the winter of 2022 made me quit nursing entirely and move 3 states away. I'm only telling this story now because I think people deserve to know what really happens in some of these places after visiting hours end. Willowbrook was a mid-sized facility housing about 80 elderly residents. From the outside, it looked like any other nursing home: clean white walls, manicured gardens, cheerful staff during the day. But at night, when the families went home and the skeleton crew took over, Willowbrook became something else entirely. I started working there in October 2022. The pay was good, better than other facilities in the area, which should have been my first warning sign. The day shift supervisor, Mrs. Chin, seemed relieved when I accepted the position. Night shift can be challenging, she told me during orientation. The residents get confused in the dark. Sometimes they wander. Sometimes they see things that aren't there. Just remember, dementia makes people experience reality differently. My first few weeks were routine. I'd make my rounds, check on residents, administer medications, help with bathroom needs. Standard nursing home duties. The residents were typical, some sweet, some cranky, most suffering from various stages of dementia or Alzheimer's. But there were 3 residents who stood out immediately. Room 237 housed Eleanor Whitfield, 89 years old, diagnosed with severe Alzheimer's. Room 241 had Robert Chin, 91, suffering from dementia and claiming to be a retired professor. Room 245 was home to Margaret Stone, 85, who'd been catatonic since arriving 6 months earlier. What made these 3 special was that they all did the same thing every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. They would sit up in their beds simultaneously and stare at something in the corner of their rooms. Not just glance, stare with the kind of focused attention that people with advanced dementia rarely display. They would remain perfectly still for exactly 11 minutes, then lie back down and sleep peacefully until morning. Every single night. I mentioned this to the day shift nurses, but they just shrugged it off. Sundowning, they said. Common in dementia patients. Their internal clocks get confused. But this wasn't sundowning. This was too precise, too synchronized. And it only happened in those 3 rooms. In November, strange things started happening during my rounds. I'd enter a resident's room to check on them, and their personal belongings would be arranged differently than they'd been an hour earlier. Photographs on nightstands would be turned face down. Flowers from family members would be wilted, even though they'd been fresh that afternoon. The temperature in certain rooms would drop so drastically I could see my breath. The residents began talking about the visitors. She came to see me last night, Eleanor told me one evening, her usually vacant eyes suddenly sharp and focused. The lady in the white dress. She sat right there in that chair and told me stories about the old days. What kind of stories? I asked, playing along. About the people who used to live in my room. About how they died. She knows all their names. Robert started having similar conversations. The professor visits me every night, he'd say. He teaches me things about this place, about what happened here before it was a nursing home. What kind of things? He told me this building used to be a hospital. A psychiatric hospital. Lots of people died here, Jessica. Lots of people who weren't ready to leave. I researched the building's history and discovered Robert was right. From 1952 to 1987, the building had been Willowbrook Psychiatric Hospital. It had been shut down following a scandal involving patient abuse and several unexplained deaths. But the most disturbing information came from Margaret Stone. Margaret hadn't spoken a word since arriving at the facility. She'd sit in her wheelchair, staring at nothing, completely unresponsive to stimulation. The doctors said she was in a vegetative state following a severe stroke. But at 3:17 a.m. every night, Margaret would sit up in bed and speak clearly for exactly 11 minutes. I discovered this during my third week when I decided to observe the 3:17 a.m. phenomenon more closely. I positioned myself outside Margaret's room and watched through the partially open door. At exactly 3:17, Margaret sat up, looked toward the corner of her room, and began speaking in a voice that was strong and coherent. "I see them," she said. "All of them. They're standing in the corner, waiting for their turn. The man in the hospital gown who died in room 237. The woman in the white dress who overdosed in room 241. The professor who hanged himself in room 245. My blood ran cold. Those were the exact rooms where Eleanor, Robert, and the previous occupant of Margaret's room had been experiencing their nightly visitors." Margaret continued, "They want to tell their stories. They want people to know what happened to them. But most people can't see them. Only the old ones, the ones whose minds are already halfway to the other side." Watched in fascination and terror as Margaret carried on a conversation with something I couldn't see, answering questions I couldn't hear, nodding in response to statements that existed only in whatever reality she was experiencing. At 3:28 a.m. exactly, Margaret lay back down and returned to her usual catatonic state. The next night, I decided to position myself in room 245 at 3:17 a.m. to see if I could observe whatever the residents were seeing. The room belonged to Harold Davies, an 87-year-old man with advanced Alzheimer's. During the day, Harold was gentle and confused, often mistaking me for his deceased daughter. But at 3:17 a.m., Harold would sit up and have animated conversations with someone he called the professor. I stood in the corner of Harold's room, watching the clock on my phone. 3:16, 3:17. Harold sat up immediately, looked directly at the corner where I was standing, and said, "Good evening, Professor. I see you brought a friend tonight." The temperature in the room dropped at least 20 degrees. I could see my breath fogging in the suddenly frigid air. And then I saw him. A man in his 60s, wearing a 1980s-style suit, standing exactly where Harold was looking. The man was translucent, like looking at someone through water, but definitely there. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "Harold, my friend," the ghost said, "I'd like you to meet Jessica. She's been taking care of you, and she can see us. That's very rare." Harold turned to look at me, his dementia-clouded eyes suddenly clear and intelligent. "Hello, Jessica. The professor has been telling me about the old days, when this was a hospital. Would you like to hear the stories?" I was too terrified to speak, but I managed to nod. The professor looked at me directly. "This facility has a dark history, Jessica. Between 1952 and 1987, over 200 patients died here under suspicious circumstances. Experimental treatments, neglect, outright abuse. Many of us never left. Why are you telling me this?" I whispered. "Because it's happening again," Harold said, his voice taking on an urgency that cut through his usual confusion. "The residents who die here aren't passing on naturally. Something in this building is keeping them trapped, feeding on their final moments." The professor nodded gravely. "We've been trying to warn people, but we can only communicate with residents whose minds are already partially in our realm. The dementia patients, the catatonic ones, those close to death, they can see us clearly. What do you want me to do? Document everything, the professor said. The suspicious deaths, the patterns, the residents who've been disappearing from their rooms at night. Administrator Mitchell knows what's happening, but he's covering it up. At exactly 3:28 a.m., both Harold and the professor faded away. Harold lay back down, returning to his normal confused state, and the temperature returned to normal. I spent the next several nights gathering the information the professor had requested. What I discovered was horrifying. Over the past 2 years, Willowbrook had experienced an unusually high death rate. Residents were dying from complications that should have been treatable, succumbing to infections that should have responded to antibiotics, suffering fatal falls that shouldn't have been possible given their limited mobility. More disturbing, several residents had gone missing during night shifts. The official reports claimed they had wandered off due to dementia, but I found no record of police searches or missing person reports. I started paying closer attention to Administrator Mitchell's behavior. He worked late most nights, often staying past midnight. His office was in the basement, and I frequently saw him carrying files and equipment down there after hours. On December 15th, I decided to investigate the basement. Using my master key, I made my way downstairs after completing my regular rounds. The basement was supposed to contain only storage rooms, laundry facilities, and mechanical equipment. But at the far end of a dimly lit hallway, I found a door that wasn't on any of the facility blueprints. The door was unlocked, and what I found inside made me understand why Willowbrook had such a high death rate. The room contained medical equipment from the 1950s, electroshock therapy machines, restraint devices, and apparatus I couldn't identify but that looked designed to cause pain rather than healing. On a desk in the corner were files documenting experiments being conducted on current residents. Mitchell was continuing the psychiatric hospital's legacy of abuse, using dementia patients for illegal medical experimentation. The residents who wandered off weren't wandering anywhere, they were being taken to this basement room for procedures that often killed them. As I photographed the evidence with my phone, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Mitchell appeared in the doorway, blocking my escape route. "I was wondering when you'd find this place," he said calmly. "The spirits have been more active lately. I assume they've been talking to you." "You're experimenting on these people," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're torturing them." "I'm continuing important research," Mitchell replied. "These people have no quality of life, no meaningful existence. At least this way, their final days serve a purpose. Their families trust you to care for them. Their families abandon them here and visit twice a year. No one cares what happens to these people once they're forgotten." Mitchell moved closer, and I saw that he was holding a syringe filled with some clear liquid. "You've seen too much, Jessica. But don't worry, you'll just be another tragic case of a young nurse who couldn't handle the stress of the job. Suicide is very common in healthcare workers." As Mitchell raised the syringe, the temperature in the room plummeted. The lights began flickering, and I heard voices, dozens of voices, whispering angrily. The professor materialized behind Mitchell, along with 20 or 30 other ghostly figures. Former patients, former residents, all the people who had died in this building over the past 70 years. "Mitchell," the professor said in a voice that echoed with supernatural authority, "your time here is finished." Mitchell spun around, the syringe falling from his hand as he saw the assembled spirits. "No," he whispered. "You're not real. You're just hallucinations." "We're very real," said a woman in a hospital gown who looked like she'd been dead for decades. And we've been waiting for justice." The ghosts surrounded Mitchell, and he began screaming. Not from physical pain, but from something deeper, as if they were forcing him to experience every moment of suffering he had inflicted on others. I ran from the basement, called 911, and contacted the state health department. The police found Mitchell in that basement room, catatonic but alive. He hasn't spoken a word since that night and is currently housed in a psychiatric facility. The investigation that followed shut down Willowbrook permanently. The evidence I'd photographed, combined with the discovery of dozens of bodies buried on the property, led to one of the largest elder abuse scandals in state history. But the strangest part of the whole experience happened on my last night at Willowbrook, as I was collecting my personal items. I visited room 245 one final time to say goodbye to Harold. As I entered his room, I found him sitting up in bed, completely lucid, his eyes clear and intelligent. "Thank you, Jessica," he said in a voice that was entirely his own, not confused or diminished by dementia. "You gave us our voices back." "Harold? You seem so alert tonight." "I am alert. For the first time in years, my mind is completely clear." The professor explained it to me. The spirits that were trapped here were drawing energy from the living residents, keeping us in a fog so we couldn't interfere with Mitchell's work. Now that justice has been served, that fog is lifting. "So you're going to get better?" Harold smiled sadly. "No, dear. My body is still dying, and my brain is still damaged by disease. But for tonight, for these few hours, I get to be myself again. I get to remember my life, my family, my accomplishments. It's a gift." He took my hand with surprising strength. "The dead aren't the only ones who can be trapped, Jessica. The living can be imprisoned by guilt, by trauma, by the terrible things they've witnessed. Don't let what you've seen here trap your spirit. You did something good. You stopped evil. Remember that." Harold passed away peacefully in his sleep that same night. The death certificate listed natural causes, organ failure due to advanced age. But I knew he had chosen his moment to leave, finally free to move on after years of supernatural imprisonment. I quit nursing and moved to Oregon, where I work as a freelance writer now. I've tried to put Willowbrook behind me, but I still have nightmares about that basement room and the things I saw there. But I also have dreams about the professor and the other spirits, finally at peace, no longer bound to a place of suffering and abuse. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder how many other facilities like Willowbrook are still operating. How many residents are being abused, experimented on, or simply neglected because society has decided their lives don't matter anymore. The elderly are invisible in our culture, forgotten and warehoused until they die. But I've learned that the dead don't always stay quiet about injustice. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear them demanding that their stories be told.